Hello, curious explorers of the world. Welcome to another episode of Explore and Discover Curious World. Today, I'm taking you on a journey through time to an era when the streets of London were filled with scandals, intrigues, and stories so bizarre they could easily compete with the best TV series. If you think today's gossip is interesting, wait until you hear what I'm about to tell you. Before we begin, I invite you to take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of our adventures. Today, we're talking about John Rykener, better known as Eleanor, a character who, if they were alive today, would undoubtedly take social media by storm with their unique and controversial story. Without further ado, buckle up and get ready for an immersive dive into 14th century London, where reality often surpassed fantasy. John Rykener's story. Introduction to the character. Imagine yourself walking the muddy streets of London in 1395. The air is thick with smoke, the sound of voices, and the clatter of carts on cobblestones. The city is a melting pot of cultures, with merchants arriving from all over Europe and beyond, bringing with them a blend of languages, customs, and scandals. In this chaotic scene, a certain John Rykener, also known as Eleanor, made their way through the crowd, attracting attention for reasons that, at the time, would have been considered shocking, if not outright heretical. John, a person we would today recognize as transgender, made a living by dressing as a woman and offering their services to both men and women. They were not an isolated case. Medieval London, like other major cities of the time, was a place where the line between legal and illegal was often blurred. Eleanor, or John, was a master at navigating these dangerous waters, living a life we might today describe as a double identity. But how did John manage to survive in such a rigid era? The answer lies in their cunning, their ability to adapt, and perhaps their courage to defy social conventions. Historical and social context. Before we delve deeper into John Rykener's life, it's useful to understand more about the historical context in which they lived. The 14th century in Europe was a time of great change. England, like much of the continent, was going through a series of crises: wars, epidemics, and not least, religious tensions. The Black Death had decimated the population just a few decades earlier, and the Catholic Church, which was supposed to be a beacon of hope, was instead embroiled in scandals and corruption. London at that time was a vibrant and dangerous city. Its streets were crowded with people of all social classes, from nobles to beggars, and among them a special category: people like John Rykener, who lived on the fringes of society. In an era where the law was harsh and often unjust, surviving meant being clever, adaptable, and sometimes willing to risk everything. Brothels were common, and it's no surprise that many of the clients were men of the church, despite the church itself preaching chastity. But, as the saying goes, preaching one thing and practicing another was the norm. The double standards of the clergy are a recurring theme in stories from this period, and John Rykener's life is a perfect example of this. John Rykener and their adventures. John Rykener's story is steeped in mystery, intrigue, and a touch of dark comedy. It is said that John was discovered while in the company of a man named John Britt, both engaged in an activity that was, let's say, not very spiritual. When Britt realized that Eleanor was actually a man, he was faced with one of the most embarrassing surprises of his life. But this wasn't just a casual disguise. John had been trained by a woman named Elizabeth, who transformed him into Eleanor. Elizabeth was an interesting character herself, a shrewd con artist who had no qualms about using any means to get money. Together, they formed a formidable team, capable of profiting from the weaknesses and fears of men of the time. Elizabeth was no stranger to these games. She had already trained her daughter Alice in the arts of deception. But John, with his ability to convincingly assume a female identity, was an even more powerful weapon. Together, Elizabeth and John staged elaborate scams, where unsuspecting men were tricked and often blackmailed. One of Elizabeth's favorite ploys was simple but effective. After a night of passion with Alice, clients would wake up to find John, dressed as a woman, beside them. Needless to say, the men's reaction was one of shock and confusion. And this was the moment when Elizabeth would step in, demanding money in exchange for their silence. But John didn't just scam common men. Their client list also included monks, friars, and even high-ranking members of the clergy. Some historians estimate that about 20% of brothel clients of the time were churchmen. This fact not only highlights the hypocrisy of the era, but adds another layer of complexity to John Rykener's story: religion and the clergy's hypocrisy. The medieval church preached chastity, but as we've seen, practice was very different from theory. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most influential medieval theologians, argued that prostitution was a necessary evil to prevent even worse sins like sodomy. According to him, sex workers were like the sewers in a palace, disgusting but essential to maintain order. Yet, despite these justifications, the church continued to openly condemn homosexuality and prostitution. This contradiction was an integral part of the lives of people like John Rykener, who found themselves living in a society that saw them as sinners, but secretly sought them out. John's story is a testament to the complexity of medieval morality. While the clergy officially condemned homosexuality, many religious figures were regular clients of people like John. This paradox is one of the reasons why their story is so fascinating and continues to be studied by researchers around the world. The political satire hypothesis. But John Rykener's story might not just be that of a cross-dresser making a living in a dangerous world. Some scholars suggest that the entire affair could have been a piece of political satire aimed at discrediting the king of the time, Richard II. The hypothesis is intriguing. The name Rykener could be a play on Richard, and the fact that John was trained by a certain Anna could be a reference to the king's wife, Anne of Bohemia, known for her delicate character. If this theory were true, John's story could be seen as an attempt to undermine the king, portraying him as a weak and effeminate figure. This kind of satire was not uncommon in the Middle Ages. In an era where censorship was strict and punishments for openly criticizing the crown were harsh, writers and poets often used allegory and double meaning to express their opinions. If John Rykener was indeed a caricature of Richard II, then their story would be one of the earliest examples of fake news in history. But, as is often the case with medieval stories, it's hard to separate truth from legend. It could be that John Rykener was a real individual whose adventures were exaggerated and reinterpreted to fit a political narrative. Or they could have been a total invention created to damage the king's reputation. A world of intrigue and secrets. John Rykener's story gives us a fascinating glimpse into a world full of intrigue, secrets, and hypocrisies. It's a world where morality was flexible, where people could live double lives, and where the truth was often hidden behind a facade of respectability. But it's also a world that reminds us that, despite all the differences between the past and the present, some things never change. The pursuit of money, power, and pleasure has always driven human actions, and people like John Rykener have always known how to exploit these weaknesses to their advantage. And so, the story of John Rykener, aka Eleanor, offers us not only a portrait of a bygone era, but also a reflection on the complexities of human nature. It's a story that reminds us that the world has always been, and probably always will be, a place of contradictions where good and evil, truth and lies, are often difficult to distinguish. And now, curious explorers, what do you think of this story? Do you believe that John Rykener was a real person? Or was he simply a political invention? And what does his story tell us about medieval society and human nature in general? Leave a comment below. I'm eager to hear your thoughts. Before you go, don't forget to give this video a big thumbs up if you enjoyed it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We wouldn't want you to miss any of our future explorations into the world of curiosities and historical scandals. Thanks for watching, and remember, stay curious, stay adventurous, and who knows, maybe together we'll discover another story even more incredible than this one. Until the next episode!